Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most chaotic yet transformative events in medieval history, the Crusades. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 1095, and you, a knight, are useless. Your castle has no wars, no tournaments, and the peasants are too broke to rob. Your sword is shiny, your horse is moody, and the highlight of your week is bullying the local miller for extra flour. Honestly, you're one ale binge away from slipping into total irrelevance. Then Pope Urban II stands up at Claremont and basically says, "Hey, you losers, want to stab people for Jesus instead of each other?" It's the best sales pitch you've ever heard. Free forgiveness of sins, eternal salvation, and all the looting you can carry. Suddenly, your calendar is packed. Finally, you've got something to do besides polishing your armor until you can see your own disappointed reflection in it. Of course, you're not the only one signing up. Every bored knight in Christendom is dusting off their chainmail, and peasants are tagging along too. They don't have armor or swords. Some show up with pitchforks and saucepans. It's less of a professional army and more of a confused mob headed for an international food festival. Except the food is imaginary, and everyone's starving by week 2. You march east with your fellow holy warriors, which is a generous term for this lot. The guy on your left is barefoot. The guy on your right thinks Jerusalem is 2 days away. Morale is high, logic is low. Still, it feels good to finally have direction, even if it's the wrong one. The church sells this as a spiritual journey, but let's be real. It's medieval HR cleanup. Europe has way too many violent knights hanging around like unpaid interns with swords. The Pope just found the perfect way to export the problem. You're no longer raiding your neighbour's pigs. Now you're raiding entire civilizations. That's career advancement. Sure, deep down you know this ends badly. Most of you will die of dysentery before even seeing a battlefield. Those who survive will probably melt inside their armour under the Middle Eastern sun. But at least you'll die doing something important, like getting lost in Anatolia or collapsing from dehydration while clutching a very rusty sword. And the best part? If you actually make it back home alive, you get to brag forever. You didn't just waste years drinking in a tavern. You were on a holy war. You're not unemployed. You're a crusader. Congratulations. You've officially upgraded from local menace to international war tourist. You're a peasant. Which means your life is a loop. Wake up, shovel mud, eat gruel, shovel more mud, collapse. Repeat until death. Entertainment consists of staring at sheep and occasionally watching your neighbour get fined for stealing firewood. It's safe to say, you're not thriving. Then the Crusades arrive, and suddenly you've got options. The Pope says, if you march east, God will forgive your sins. That's appealing, because between stealing turnips and cursing your landlord under your breath, you've racked up quite the spiritual debt. Besides, the idea of leaving your tiny village where everyone smells like cabbage soup and regret sounds exotic. So you pack up your one good tunic, kiss your equally malnourished family goodbye, and join the mob. Congratulations. Your life just upgraded from mud farmer to international mud marcher. The journey is terrible, of course. You quickly learn that walking across continents in leather shoes was a mistake. Food runs out fast. People die of plague, dysentery, and sometimes sheer boredom. You're constantly hungry, constantly lost, and constantly wishing you'd just stayed home digging potatoes. But here's the thing. For the first time ever, you're seeing things. Cities with stone walls taller than anything in your entire region. Markets where spices and fabrics dazzle your mud-caked eyes. Constantinople alone blows your mind. Its domes, mosaics, and running water make your village look like a pigsty with delusions of grandeur. You can't stop staring. You also can't stop thinking about how many chickens you'd have to steal to afford a single lamp from these markets. And when you finally arrive in the Holy Land, assuming you survive the road, you're walking in places you've only heard about in church sermons mumbled by half-asleep priests. Jerusalem, Bethlehem. It feels unreal. You're sweaty, starving, and your clothes are falling apart. But you've made it further than anyone in your family has ever dreamed. Back home, people live and die within a 5-mile radius. You've marched across Europe and Asia, seen cities your neighbours can't even pronounce, and eaten food that wasn't boiled turnips. Sure, you nearly died 6 times, and you'll probably never be the same again. But compared to endless years of farming mud, this feels almost glamorous. The Crusades might kill you, but they've already rescued you from the most terrifying fate of all. Dying of boredom in your cabbage patch, you've trudged for months through mud, forests and hostile villages, and you're starting to wonder if this crusade thing is just an elaborate prank. Then suddenly, there it is, Constantinople, and your medieval peasant brain can barely process what you're looking at. First off, the walls. You've seen wooden fences before, maybe a stone wall if your local lord was feeling fancy. But here, the walls stretch so high, they might as well scrape the heavens. They're thick, layered, and guarded by people who actually know what they're doing. If your village had walls like this, you'd never have to chase your pigs out of the neighbour's cabbage patch again. Then you step inside. Your jaw hits the ground. Markets overflowing with silks and spices. Fountains spouting clean water, not the murky swamp juice you're used to drinking. Domes glinting in the sunlight, so polished they practically mock the leaky thatched roof you once called home. The Hagia Sophia alone looks like it was designed by angels with far too much free time. And the food. Oh, the food. Fresh bread that doesn't taste like sadness. Meat seasoned with spices you can't even name. Sweet desserts dripping with honey. You take one bite and realise your entire culinary experience back home has been a crime against humanity. Suddenly, boiled turnips feel like a personal insult. Of course, you also realise you look like absolute garbage compared to the locals. You're covered in dirt, your clothes smell like goat, and you've got the haunted stare of someone who hasn't bathed since Advent. Meanwhile, Constantinopolitans are strutting around in robes of silk, dripping in jewellery, as if to remind you that you're the medieval version of a tourist in sweatpants. Still, you can't deny it. You're awestruck. This city is the crossroads of the world, where east meets west, where trade routes pour in treasures, and where peasants like you finally understand how pitiful your mud hut really is. Do you feel slightly resentful? Absolutely. Do you also start fantasizing about smuggling some of this wealth back home? Definitely. Constantinople isn't just a city. It's a slap in the face to everything you thought civilization meant. For the first time, you realise the crusade might actually be worth it. Even if you die tomorrow, at least you got to see a city that made your entire village look like an accident someone forgot to clean up. Back home, dinner is the same sad rotation. Bread that could double as masonry, porridge that tastes like wet hay, and the occasional boiled cabbage, a dish so bland it makes you question why you even bother chewing. If you're really lucky, you get some salted pork that tastes like it was cured during the last ice age. Then you march east on crusade, stumble into a marketplace, and your entire concept of food implodes. You see strange powders, red, gold, black, and green. Merchants scoop them up with delicate spoons and wave the scents in your direction. The smell alone makes you suspicious. Food with aroma? That's witchcraft where you come from. But you're curious. You sprinkle some of this so-called pepper onto your stale bread. And suddenly, you're alive. It's spicy, sharp, exciting. You sneeze so hard you nearly drop your bread, but you don't care. For the first time in your life, food has flavour beyond burnt or rotten. Then comes cinnamon. You try a pinch and it tastes sweet, warm, almost comforting, like if joy had a flavour. You suddenly understand why nobles back home are willing to pay a fortune for this stuff. It's not just food anymore. It's an experience. Of course, as you marvel at the taste, you realise you've been lied to your entire life. All those years of eating watery gruel, completely unnecessary. The world had spices this whole time. It's just that nobody in your miserable corner of Europe bothered to share them with you. And while you're falling in love with spices, you're also falling in love with the idea of wealth. Because you watch merchants haggle, and you see the sacks of silver changing hands for a single bag of pepper. Pepper. The stuff that makes you sneeze. Suddenly you're doing medieval math. If you can somehow steal, smuggle, or just borrow a sack of it home, you'll never shovel mud again. Spices aren't just food. They're power. They're status. They're a giant, fragrant middle finger to the boiled cabbage still rotting in your village pot back home. You don't know it yet, but thanks to these spices, Europe will develop trade routes, empires, and entire wars over flavour. All you know right now is that your taste buds are screaming, "Where has this been all my life?" Congratulations, you've just discovered spices, and dinner will never taste like despair again. Back home, sweet means maybe finding a berry that hasn't been eaten by birds yet. Dessert is not a concept. The closest you've come is bread so undercooked it's still doughy in the middle. Then you march east, stumble into a market, and someone hands you candied fruit. The first bite hits like divine revelation. Your tongue, which until now has known only flavours like muddy turnip and burnt gruel, suddenly thinks it's in heaven. Honey-coated figs, sugar-dusted almonds, syrups so sweet they make your teeth ache instantly. You don't know it yet, but congratulations. You've just been introduced to your new lifelong addiction. Sugar isn't just food here. It's medicine, spice, and luxury all rolled into one. Apothecaries are selling it for stomach ailments. Nobles are sprinkling it on meat. Pastry makers are sculpting it into castles. You, meanwhile, are shoveling candied nuts into your mouth like a starved raccoon. The problem is, sugar isn't cheap. It's grown in faraway plantations, harvested by armies of workers, and shipped in carefully guarded convoys. You're eating someone's yearly salary with every bite. Back home, even your lord couldn't afford this on a regular basis. But right now, you don't care. You're too busy vibrating with happiness after discovering food that doesn't make you depressed. Of course, the side effects are immediate. Your energy spikes, your hands shake, your heart races, and then comes the crash. You slump against a stall, candied figs dripping from your mouth, realizing you've just overdosed on medieval cocaine. And you want more. So much more. By the time you stagger home years later, you'll be raving about sugar like it's a miracle. Nobles will pay insane prices to import it. Entire economies will bend to demand. And peasants like you, you'll just dream about it while gnawing your stale bread. What you don't realise, as you lick sticky syrup off your fingers, is that Europe's new obsession with sugar will reshape history. It will drive trade routes, spark wars, and fuel empires. But right now, all you know is this. Sugar makes boiled cabbage taste less like despair. Congratulations, you're no longer just a crusader. You're a walking advertisement for the sweetest drug of the Middle Ages. You didn't sign up for this crusade to learn anything. Let's be clear. You came for salvation, loot, and maybe a dramatic death story your grandchildren could exaggerate later. But somewhere along the road, between bouts of dysentery and stabbing the wrong people, you start noticing things. Like doctors. Real doctors. Not the guy back home who thinks headaches require drilling holes in your skull. Here in the East, physicians are handing out herbal remedies, setting bones properly, and even washing their hands before surgery. Washing their hands. Back home, your barber surgeon probably wiped his knife on his pants and called it sterile. Then there are the books. Entire libraries stuffed with Greek philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine. Ideas that your village priest would have happily burned as heresy. You can't read a word of it, of course, but you can tell this is the good stuff. Some smarter crusader will drag copies back west, and suddenly Europe won't have to reinvent the wheel every 2 centuries. And numbers. Have you ever seen the number 0? You hadn't, until now. At first you're suspicious. How can nothing be a number? Sounds like witchcraft. But then someone explains Arabic numerals, and suddenly math doesn't take 3 hours and 6 monks to tally sheep. It's efficient, it's clever, and it makes Roman numerals look like the drunk doodles they are. Even architecture is teaching you things. You walk past mosques with soaring domes and minarets that make your church look like a pig shed. You see aqueducts and fountains still running after centuries, and you realise your village well filled with frogs might not be the peak of engineering. The irony is that you're not trying to absorb any of this. You're just passing through, sword in hand, staring at things you don't understand. But the knowledge seeps in anyway. You go home bragging about strange remedies, smarter numbers, and buildings that don't collapse every winter. You sound half insane, but some monk will write it down, and a century later people will act like Europe just invented it. You came to fight for God. Instead, you tripped over science, math, and medicine like loose coins in the street. Congratulations, you're not just a crusader now. You're a very unwilling, very confused cultural exchange program. You weren't expecting the Crusades to turn you into an art critic, but here we are. Back home, the average church is a squat rectangle of stone, with a roof that leaks and walls so plain they make you sleepy just looking at them. It's basically a barn with a cross nailed on top. Then you march east and see buildings that make your jaw drop. Domes so massive they seem to hover in the sky. Arches tall enough to make your neck hurt. Windows filled with coloured glass that actually lets in light, instead of keeping it out like the tiny arrow slits in your church. You stand there gaping, trying to figure out how anyone built this without divine help, or at the very least, a very large ladder. Naturally, you go home and brag about it. You tell masons, "Hey, I saw a church bigger than 10 castles stacked together, and it had windows brighter than the sunrise." They laugh at you until someone actually tries it, and suddenly, Gothic architecture is born. Now, churches aren't just barns with bells. They're soaring cathedrals with flying buttresses that look ridiculous until you realise they keep the walls from collapsing. Builders start carving pointed arches everywhere, like medieval graphic designers who just discovered a new font, and stained glass becomes the medieval equivalent of Netflix. Peasants can now watch the Bible in colourful pictures, since most of them can't read anyway. The best part? These new churches terrify people into piety. Walk into a Gothic cathedral and you're dwarfed by stone pillars, blinding windows and ceilings that vanish into shadows. Suddenly you're convinced God is watching, and he's not impressed with your recent sins. Mission accomplished. Sure, construction takes decades, sometimes centuries. You might lay one brick and die before the spire is halfway done, but your grandchildren will get to say, "Grandad worked on that flying buttress," which is basically the medieval version of being in the credits of a blockbuster movie. So yes, you went on crusade to stab people, but you came back with design inspiration. Without your trip, Notre Dame wouldn't exist. Chartres would just be a pile of rubble, and Europe's churches would still look like sad stone boxes. You thought the Crusades were about religion. The Pope said something about Jerusalem, salvation, and eternal glory. But then you pass through Venice, and it hits you. This whole thing is also a giant money-making scheme. Venetian merchants don't fight in Crusades. They profit from them. While you're sweating under armour and eating stale bread, they're selling ships, supplies, and overpriced wine to desperate knights who don't know how to haggle. You need passage to the Holy Land? Venice has a boat. It's rickety, smells like fish and probably leaks, but it'll cost you a small fortune. Don't like it? Too bad. Venice has a monopoly, and they know it. As you march off to battle, the Venetians stay behind counting coins. Then, when the war goes sideways, as it always does, they swoop in, hauling back silks, spices, and sugar. You're trudging through deserts on foot while they're cruising the Mediterranean, inventing the concept of first-class travel. By the time you stagger home, Venice is unrecognisable. The city is dripping with wealth. Marble palaces line the canals. Merchants wear robes so fancy they look like kings. The local baker has a better house than your feudal lord. Venice has gone from a swampy lagoon with delusions of grandeur to the Wall Street of the Middle Ages, and all thanks to your hard work bleeding in foreign fields. The best part? Venetians don't even hide it. They flaunt their riches with festivals, masks, and banquets that make your mud village feasts look like sad picnics. While you're bragging about surviving dysentery in Antioch, they're bragging about their new warehouse full of peppercorns. Guess who people are more impressed with? Of course, Venice doesn't just get rich, it gets powerful. Their navy dominates the seas, their bankers control debts, and before long, even kings are kissing Venetian rings just to borrow cash. All because the Crusades turned the Mediterranean into their personal business playground? You thought you were fighting for God. In reality, you were unpaid security for Venice's shipping empire. The Crusades gave you blisters. Venice got filthy rich. You thought you were signing up for a holy mission, a once-in-a-lifetime act of devotion. In reality, you've just booked the world's first package tour. Minus the travel insurance, comfy lodging, or any actual planning, it starts with the march. Tens of thousands of you are trudging along the same road, all headed vaguely east. You don't know where exactly, because maps are rare and mostly wrong. Someone up front claims to know the way, but he's also the same guy who thought Cologne was in France. You decide to trust him anyway, because what's the worst that could happen? Spoiler: starvation, plague, or being ambushed by angry locals. The journey feels less like a military expedition and more like a chaotic medieval sightseeing trip. You shuffle from one unfamiliar city to another, gawking at buildings, markets, and people who look at you like you're a sweaty, unwelcome mob. Which, to be fair, you are. Your army's arrival is basically a medieval flash mob, except instead of dancing, you're looting their food supplies. The Pope promised a pilgrimage, but what you're really experiencing is the medieval version of budget travel. You sleep outside, share questionable meals with strangers, and hope nobody steals your shoes while you're snoring. Hygiene is non-existent. By week 3, you smell so bad that even your horse avoids standing downwind. There's also the entertainment factor. The crusade becomes its own moving circus. You've got jugglers, priests shouting sermons at dawn, merchants hawking overpriced bread, and self-proclaimed prophets announcing doom every time someone sneezes. It's half holy mission, half carnival, and entirely exhausting. And the destinations? Forget spa resorts or beach views. You're headed for war zones. Every stop promises less relaxation and more stabbing. Antioch, siege. Jerusalem, siege. Acre, yet another siege. Your holiday package includes lots of standing around starving while waiting for the enemy to surrender. Congratulations, you've invented all-inclusive misery. But here's the kicker. When it's all over, you get to go home and brag. You'll tell your neighbours about the cities you saw, the deserts you crossed, the relics you touched. They'll be impressed, even though you leave out the part where you spent most of the trip trying not to die of diarrhea. So yes, you joined the first medieval package tour. It had no refunds, terrible catering, and a high chance of death. But at least the stories are priceless. You've been told your enemies in the East are monsters, godless barbarians who eat babies, drink blood, and never bathe. Which is funny, because when you finally cross paths with Saladin, the famous Muslim leader, he turns out to be cleaner, smarter, and frankly more polite than anyone in your entire army. First of all, the man actually takes baths, regularly. That alone already makes him more terrifying than half your fellow Crusaders, who smell like a goat farm set on fire. Saladin dresses in silk, carries himself like a king, and, worst of all, doesn't immediately die when he sees your glorious European tactics, which mostly consist of charging in a straight line and hoping God sorts out the details. Then there's his reputation. Even your leaders whisper about it. Saladin fights like a lion, strategizes like a genius, and treats prisoners better than you treat your own comrades. He even once sent fruit and ice to Richard the Lionheart when the man was sick. Imagine that, your greatest enemy delivering a medieval get-well basket while you're still arguing with your squad over who gets the least mouldy loaf of bread. When you finally face him in battle, you realize why the legends stick. His armies don't panic, don't scatter, and don't spend 3 hours arguing over who forgot the siege ladder. They move like they've actually trained for this. You, meanwhile, are wearing 50 pounds of armour in the middle of the desert and wondering if it's too late to fake heatstroke. And here's the real kicker. Even when he beats you, and he usually does, Saladin comes across as the good guy. Chroniclers describe him as merciful, noble, even chivalrous. That's awkward, because you've been promised eternal glory for stabbing his men, and yet you can't help thinking you'd rather follow him than your own half-drunk commander. Of course, back home, the bards will spin this differently. They'll say you fought a terrifying infidel, not a generous statesman. They'll gloss over the fact that Saladin has better manners, better logistics, and better skincare than your entire army combined. But you'll remember. You'll remember the man who managed to make you feel like the rude, smelly invader in someone else's backyard. You've spent your whole life scribbling on parchment, which is just animal skin stretched, scraped, and dried, until it resembles leather that failed its career as a shoe. It's thick, it's expensive, and it smells faintly like regret. If you need something cheaper, you use wax tablets or just carve notes into wood like a caveman. Writing is a chore, and books are so rare that your village priest still chains his Bible to the pulpit like it's the crown jewels. Then, somewhere in the east, someone hands you a sheet of paper. At first, you're confused. It's thin, smooth, and, here's the shocker, not made out of dead cow. You bend it in your hands, and it doesn't crack. You write on it, and the ink doesn't smear instantly into a sad blob. It's light, it folds, and you can stack dozens of sheets without needing a small army of oxen to carry them. You immediately suspect witchcraft. Nothing this convenient should exist. But no, it's just paper. Invented in China centuries ago, perfected in the Islamic world, and now blowing your medieval mind like the iPhone of the 12th century. Suddenly the possibilities start clicking. With paper, copying books doesn't require sacrificing a herd of sheep. Letters can travel without being bulky, brittle scrolls. Bureaucracy, God help us, can actually expand, because now nobles and kings can produce contracts, decrees, and tax records faster than ever. In other words, your feudal paperwork just went from rare nuisance to daily nightmare. Thanks, paper. Of course, your first instinct as a crusader is not to appreciate the cultural value, but to imagine how much you can sell this stuff for back home. Your neighbours will lose their minds when they see something that isn't calfskin masquerading as literature. A whole new black market is born, where paper becomes as desirable as pepper or sugar. And though you don't realise it yet, paper is going to reshape Europe forever. Universities will thrive, literacy will spread, and eventually some guy named Gutenberg will figure out printing presses, all because crusaders like you stumbled east, saw something cooler than parchment, and decided to copy it. So yes, you came for salvation and loot. Instead, you discovered stationery. Congratulations. You've just upgraded Europe from cowhide scribbles to civilized paperwork. And now every medieval scribe owes you a thank you card, written on paper, of course. You've been marching for years. You're hot, tired, broke, and still not entirely sure where Jerusalem is on a map. But don't worry, this time the plan is foolproof. The Fourth Crusade will succeed where the others failed. Spoiler, it doesn't. First problem? Venice. You and your fellow crusaders promised to pay them for ships to sail to the Holy Land, but when it comes time to cough up the gold, you're all broke. Turns out most knights are terrible at budgeting. Venice isn't mad, though. They're helpful. They offer a deal. Instead of paying in cash, how about you sack Zara, a Christian city, for them? You know, just a quick pit stop of treachery. So you do it. Congratulations. You've just attacked fellow Christians before even seeing an infidel. Jerusalem is already looking like a distant dream. Then things really go sideways. A Byzantine prince shows up with promises of cash, supplies, and troops if you'll just help him take Constantinople back from his enemies. And because you've already committed one oops, why not double down? Off to Constantinople you go. What follows is less holy war and more looting vacation. Instead of marching on Jerusalem, you and your comrades storm the greatest Christian city in the East. You burn, pillage, and strip it of treasures. Priceless relics, gone. Ancient manuscripts, torched. Horses, looted. Even the bronze horses from a racetrack are dragged back to Venice. Nothing says for Christ's glory like stealing statues for home decor. As you stumble through palaces grabbing candlesticks, you realize this is a new low. The crusade didn't just miss the target, it hit the wrong continent. You were supposed to save Christianity's holiest city. Instead, you've permanently crippled the Eastern Roman Empire, your supposed ally. Nice work. The irony is rich. Instead of uniting Christendom, the Fourth Crusade split it for good. Constantinople never fully recovered. Meanwhile, Venice became richer than ever, swimming in stolen treasure while you drag yourself home empty-handed. You wanted glory. You got infamy. You set out to fight infidels and ended up robbing fellow Christians. Congratulations. You've just lived through the most spectacular medieval GPS fail of all time. Back home, your vocabulary is limited. Most of your sentences are some variation of, yes, my lord, no, my lord, or, please don't hang me, my lord. Your world is tiny, your words are tinier, and the most exotic phrase you know is ale, please. Then you go on crusade, and suddenly your ears are assaulted by languages that don't sound like someone choking on porridge. You hear Arabic, Greek, Turkish, Armenian, a whole Tower of Babel crammed into marketplaces and battlefields. At first, you think everyone's just shouting insults at you, but slowly you realize they're actual words, useful ones. You pick up sugar because your new addiction demands a vocabulary to match. You learn cotton because you'd like to stop dressing in wool sacks that itch like they were designed by Satan. You stumble across algebra, and though you don't understand it, you know it sounds smarter than anything you've ever said. Try dropping that word in your village tavern. Instant respect, even if you still can't count past 20 without taking your shoes off. Some words slip into your speech whether you want them to or not. Coffee, though you can't afford it. Bazaar. Checkmate. Before long, you're sprinkling them into conversation like you invented them. Your neighbours stare at you like you've become a wizard. You let them. Back in Europe, these borrowed words spread like wildfire. Nobles love tossing them around to sound cultured. Monks copy them into manuscripts, sometimes misspelling them so badly they create new words entirely. Before long, everyone's pretending they've always known what satin or lemon means. Of course, you don't get credit for this. Nobody's going to write, "Thank you, random sweaty crusader, for enriching our vocabulary." But the truth is, without you and your fellow accidental linguists, Europe would still be stuck describing everything as meat or not meat. Language is power, and by lugging home these shiny new words, you've accidentally made your world sound a little bigger, a little fancier, and a lot more confusing. So yes, you still smell like a swamp, and your sword is rusty. But when you walk into the tavern and casually mention sugar or algebra, everyone's impressed. Congratulations, you've gone from village idiot to international linguist, and all it took was a few years of holy war. You stagger home from the Crusades half dead, sunburned, and smelling like a camel's armpit. But here's the silver lining. Nobody back in your mud-caked village knows what really happened, which means you're about to become the most interesting storyteller within 50 miles. At the tavern, you drop your first tale. You don't mention the dysentery, the endless marching, or the fact that you once got lost for 3 days because your captain couldn't read a map. Instead, you talk about the time you fought valiantly at Antioch. By valiantly, you mean you stood behind a wall holding a rusty spear, hoping someone else did the stabbing. But your neighbours don't know that. To them, you're practically Richard the Lionheart's right-hand man. And that's the beauty of it. The truth doesn't matter. The Crusades were such a chaotic mess that any story you tell sounds believable. Did you slay 10 enemy knights with one hand? Sure. Did you scale the walls of Jerusalem using only your bare feet and divine willpower? Why not? Did you personally wrestle Saladin? Absolutely, and you nearly won too, but he cheated, obviously. The best part? Nobody can prove you wrong. There's no medieval fact-checker scrolling through parchment archives to call you out. Your word is gospel, and every time you embellish, your reputation grows. Soon, people are calling you the hero who saw the Holy Land, instead of that guy who used to steal cabbages. These stories don't just entertain, they inspire. Priests turn them into sermons, bards weave them into songs, and nobles commission tapestries of battles that never quite happened that way. Over time, the Crusades transform from a logistical disaster into a noble epic, all because you and your buddies couldn't resist bragging. Of course, you remember the truth. The fleas, the hunger, the endless waiting during sieges, the fights over mouldy bread. But you'll never admit that part. Why waste a good legend with details about diarrhea? So yes, the Crusades gave you scars, trauma, and probably a lifelong limp. But they also gave you legendary stories to tell around the fire. And in the Middle Ages, a good story is worth more than gold. Congratulations, you've gone from anonymous mud farmer to myth-making world traveller. All it cost you was your youth, your health, and possibly your sanity. You set out thinking the Crusades would be simple. March east, stab some infidels, grab a relic or two, and march home to eternal glory. Easy. Instead, you nearly died of dysentery 12 times, lost 3 pairs of shoes in the mud, and spent more days waiting around hungry than actually fighting. By all accounts, you should come home a failure. And yet, somehow, you've just changed Europe forever. Because while you were busy stumbling through deserts and stealing figs from markets, you accidentally opened the floodgates of global exchange. You brought home spices that made dinner edible, sugar that turned nobles into addicts, and paper that turned monks into productivity machines. You introduced new words, new trade routes, and new diseases. Sorry, Europe. You even inspired architects to stop building sad stone barns and start raising cathedrals that looked like they were designed by overachieving giants. The irony. None of this was intentional. You didn't march to the Holy Land thinking, "Ah yes, let me spark the Renaissance and modern banking systems." You just wanted to not go to hell and maybe loot a gold candlestick along the way. But history doesn't care about your intentions, only your mess. And oh boy, what a glorious mess you made. Meanwhile, Venice and Genoa are now swimming in cash, thanks to your unpaid labour. Kings and nobles suddenly realise there's money to be made in trade. Scholars discover that the East has libraries, medicine, and actual math, and suddenly Europe starts looking a little less backward. Even your mud village benefits. The tavern now serves food with pepper, and people drop fancy new words like sugar and algebra as if they've always known them. Sure, millions died, cities burned, and the Crusades ultimately failed at their stated goal. But the aftermath is undeniable. Europe got its cultural, economic, and intellectual booster shot, courtesy of you, the unwilling delivery system. So when you limp back home, scarred, broke, and smelling faintly of goat, just remember this. You didn't just waste years on a hopeless holy war. You jump-started centuries of change. Congratulations. You've accidentally dragged Europe kicking and screaming into the future. And all it took was one very messy, very misguided, but, let's admit it, kind of awesome crusade. The earliest jousts were messy, almost indistinguishable from outright brawls. Groups of knights charged one another in chaotic melees, swinging swords, swinging maces, or lowering lances. Safety wasn't exactly a priority, and neither was fairness. Horses were trampled, men were killed, and villages unlucky enough to host these contests sometimes found their fields churned into mud and their barns stripped for makeshift viewing stands. But even in this chaos, a pattern began to form. The thrill of two knights, alone, charging at one another on horseback became the highlight. Slowly, that spectacle pulled away from the group melees and developed into its own dedicated event. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, jousting was no longer a wild free-for-all, but a contest with a purpose. Knights would line up on opposite sides of a long wooden barrier called a tilt. Then, spurred forward, they would thunder across the field, lances levelled, aiming not to kill, but to strike with precision. The goal was clear: shatter your lance on your opponent's shield or armour, or unseat him entirely if you had the strength and skill. What set jousting apart was not just its danger, but its symbolism. To sit tall on a destrier, lance steady, shield gleaming with heraldic colours, was to announce to the world, "I am a knight, and my honour is beyond reproach." Even if you lost, the act of showing up, of charging into danger for the sake of reputation, could elevate your standing. This was no longer just training for war, it was theatre, ritual, and the foundation of knightly identity. From its chaotic beginnings in the blood-soaked melees of early tournaments, jousting had begun to take shape as something more refined, something that would eventually dominate the culture of the medieval aristocracy for centuries to come. For a medieval knight, the joust was far more than a sporting match. It was a public declaration of character, a test not only of skill with the lance, but of courage, loyalty, and self-control. When two armoured men met in the tilt yard, they carried with them the weight of family honour, noble lineage, and the entire code of chivalry. To triumph was to shine in the eyes of one's peers and, more importantly, in the eyes of ladies watching from the stands. To falter, to flinch, or worse, to refuse the challenge, meant disgrace that could cling for a lifetime. Honour in the Middle Ages was a currency as valuable as land. For a knight, reputation determined whether kings offered command in battle, whether lords granted fiefs, and whether noble families opened their doors in marriage alliances. The joust became a stage upon which all of this could be displayed. Knights would wear their heraldic colours proudly, their shields emblazoned with coats of arms that shouted their family heritage across the lists. Every charge down the tilt was a chance to reinforce the story of who they were and who they claimed to be. The rules of jousting as they evolved were designed to reflect this obsession with honour. It was not enough to simply knock an opponent from his horse. Doing so in a reckless or dishonourable way, such as striking outside the permitted zones of shield or chest, could bring shame rather than glory. Clean breaks of the lance, made with precision and restraint, were celebrated as marks of refinement and mastery. A knight who smashed 3 lances in perfect succession could become as celebrated as one who unseated his foe. Spectators, too, understood the moral weight of these contests. They didn't just see two men crashing into one another. They saw bravery, discipline, and the knightly ideal embodied. For women of the court, the joust also became a theatre of romance. Knights often dedicated their charge to a lady, tying her favour, perhaps a scarf, a ribbon, or a glove, onto their arm before riding into the lists. Success was proof of devotion. Failure could be spun into tragic gallantry. Thus, the joust was never just about breaking wood and bruising ribs. It was about the performance of honour itself. Each tilt was a miniature war in which the stakes were not land or life, but reputation, the invisible crown every knight sought to wear. As jousting matured from wild melees into a more refined contest, rules became essential. Without them, the tilt yard was simply a chaotic gamble of life and death. With them, it became a disciplined sport that mirrored the order and ideals of chivalry. By the 13th century, jousting manuals and heralds carefully codified what was allowed, what was forbidden, and what counted as victory. At the heart of it all was the tilt, the long wooden barrier running down the centre of the field. It wasn't there for decoration. The tilt served to keep horses from colliding head-on and to force knights to ride straight and true. Each rider had his lane, and any deviation could be considered dishonourable, if not outright cheating. Staying in your lane was as much about discipline as it was about safety. The lances themselves were adapted for the sport. Gone were the sharpened war lances of the battlefield. Instead, they were tipped with coronals, blunted heads designed to spread the impact rather than pierce. Still, a well-placed strike could snap ribs, unseat a rider, or even kill a knight if fortune turned cruel. Victory came from striking the correct target zones, primarily the shield or torso. A clean break of the lance against these areas earned points, while blows to the horse or below the waist were illegal and could disqualify a knight. Heralds played a key role in enforcing these rules. They announced each match, declared the coats of arms of the competitors, and ensured the contest was fought within the boundaries of honour. Heralds also tallied points and determined winners when matches became too close to call. Their presence gave the joust an air of officialdom and ceremony, transforming what might otherwise be brawls into spectacles of legitimacy. There were also unwritten rules, those of conduct and demeanour. A knight who mocked an opponent, struck after a tilt was finished, or refused to salute the ladies watching from the stands might technically win his match, but lose the respect of the audience. The joust demanded not just physical power but self-control, restraint, and an almost theatrical dignity. Over time, these rules turned jousting into more than training for battle. It became an art form, part sport, part pageant, part moral display. To ride into the lists was to submit to the laws of chivalry as much as to the impact of a lance. If jousting was the stage, then heraldry was the costume. The lists were as much about being seen as they were about skill with the lance. A knight did not simply ride into combat clad in plain steel. He was a walking canvas of colour, symbols and identity. In a world where literacy was rare, heraldic designs served as the medieval signature, instantly recognisable, proudly inherited, and carefully guarded. Each knight bore a coat of arms, painted boldly on shield, surcoat, horse caparison, and even the lance's pennant. Lions, eagles, crosses, fleur-de-lis. These weren't just pretty designs. They told stories of lineage, of oaths sworn, of lands defended and loyalties declared. A glance at the colours and symbols of an opponent could reveal not just his family, but his allegiances, his rivals, and sometimes even his ambitions. The joust elevated this symbolism to new heights. For spectators, the lists became a living tapestry of pageantry. Nobles and commoners alike crowded to watch knights thunder down the tilt, banners snapping in the wind, horses draped in cloth dyed with costly pigments. Scarlet, azure, and gold shone under the sun, and when knights crashed together, splinters of wood flew against a backdrop of dazzling colour. For many, this was theatre as much as sport, an explosion of spectacle in an otherwise grey and harsh world. Heralds ensured that colours and arms were displayed properly. Their role was part referee, part announcer, part genealogist. They proclaimed each knight's name and ancestry before the joust, ensuring the crowd knew exactly who was risking honour on the field. Heralds were also watchdogs of heraldry itself, guarding against impostors or knights who might dare to bear arms not rightfully theirs. In this way, heraldry was tied directly to credibility. Wearing false colours was a scandal equal to cowardice. The colours also carried romantic weight. A knight might wear the favour of a lady, perhaps a ribbon, a veil, or a piece of embroidered fabric, woven into his helm or bound to his arm. This was more than decoration. It was a declaration. Each strike of the lance was dedicated to her, each splintering blow proof of devotion. In this way, heraldry became not just a language of family and honour, but also of love and loyalty. Thus, jousting transformed into more than combat. It was a vibrant spectacle where colour spoke louder than words, and every knight became both warrior and symbol. By the height of the Middle Ages, the joust had grown far beyond a mere contest between two knights. It became the centrepiece of grand tournaments, festivals of pageantry that could last days, even weeks, and draw thousands of spectators. Kings and queens attended, nobles brought their entire retinues, and merchants flocked to sell food, trinkets, and fine cloth. For common folk, who might never glimpse a battlefield or a royal court, the tournament offered a rare chance to see knights in their shining glory, riding beneath banners that crackled in the wind. Tournaments were carefully staged. Lists, the fenced-off arenas where jousts were fought, were erected in town squares or open fields. Wooden stands were built for noble spectators, with the best seats reserved for royalty and the highest-ranking lords. The presence of ladies was crucial. They judged not only skill but also style, their applause elevating a knight's triumph to something greater than mere victory. A knight who rode boldly but bowed gallantly at the end of a tilt might win more admiration than one who simply unseated his opponent. The joust itself was usually the highlight, but tournaments included other entertainments as well. There were melees, large group combats that recalled the joust's rougher origins. There were banquets, filled with roasted meats, spiced wines, and elaborate displays of sugar and pastry shaped into castles or animals. Jugglers, minstrels, and dancers entertained the crowds between bouts. A great tournament was as much carnival as it was combat. Ceremony was just as important as fighting. Knights would parade into the lists in procession, their horses caparisoned in dazzling fabrics, their shields polished until they gleamed. Trumpets blared, heralds called names, and banners rippled in the sun. The event was theatre, a carefully orchestrated show meant to dazzle. Even the pauses, when splintered lances were replaced, or horses were led off for rest, were opportunities for nobles to gossip, bet on outcomes, or admire the finery of armour and cloth. For rulers, tournaments were also political tools. Hosting a lavish joust displayed wealth and power, reinforcing bonds of loyalty among the nobility. Kings could reward favoured knights with prizes, jewels, or even land, turning spectacle into strategy. At the same time, rivals could size one another up without the risks of actual war. In short, the medieval tournament was a blend of battle and festival, a stage where the ideals of knighthood met the hunger for entertainment. It was blood sport, but also pageant, a show where knights fought not only for victory but for the gaze of the crowd. If the clash of lances was the heartbeat of a tournament, romance was its soul. The joust was never only about men proving their strength, it was also about winning admiration, particularly from the ladies watching in the stands. In the culture of chivalry, a knight's reputation was measured not just by his victories, but by his devotion to ideals of loyalty, courtesy, and love. And nowhere did these ideals shine brighter than in the tilt yard. Knights often rode into the lists wearing the favour of a lady. This could be as simple as a ribbon, a veil, or even a glove tied to the arm or fastened to the helm. Small though it was, this token transformed the joust into a performance of courtly love. Every strike of the lance, every charge into danger, became a declaration of devotion. To break a lance in a lady's honour was to declare before the entire assembly that her beauty and virtue inspired courage. The ladies themselves were not passive observers. They judged the contests, granted favours, and sometimes even decided the victor in cases of dispute. Their applause or disdain could elevate a knight's reputation, or tarnish it beyond repair. A knight might win the match, but if he rode without elegance, or failed to dedicate his efforts to a noble cause, he risked being dismissed as brutish rather than gallant. Romance, however, was not always innocent. Behind the poetry and pageantry, politics lurked. A knight might seek the favour of a powerful noblewoman, not only for admiration, but to forge alliances or advance his position at court. A smile or token from the right lady could open doors in a world where status was everything. In this way, the joust blurred the line between personal affection and political ambition. Medieval poets and troubadours added fuel to this culture. They sang of knights who braved lances and swords for the love of unattainable ladies, their verses spreading the idea that true knighthood was incomplete without devotion. The joust became living poetry, chivalric ideals made visible in wood and steel. Thus, the tilt yard was both battlefield and stage. Knights fought not just for honour, but for love, real or imagined. The thunder of hooves and splintering lances echoed with another message, that in the theatre of chivalry, courage and romance were inseparable. For all its rules, pageantry, and blunted lances, jousting was never truly safe. Beneath the chivalric rituals and colourful banners lay a brutal reality. Men were hurt, maimed, and sometimes killed in the lists. The tilt yard was meant to display honour, but it could just as easily end in tragedy. The danger began with the sheer force of impact. 2 armoured knights charging at full gallop could generate tremendous momentum. Even with coronals, blunted lance tips designed to spread the blow, the impact often shattered more than just wood. Broken ribs, concussions, dislocated shoulders, and punctured lungs were all common outcomes. A knight unhorsed might fall awkwardly, pinned beneath his destrier or trampled in the chaos. Armour helped, but even the best plate could not entirely soften a lance's shock. Some injuries came not from the lance, but from the splinters. When a lance shattered on impact, shards of wood could fly like missiles. Chroniclers record knights blinded when splinters pierced their visors, or scarred when fragments lodged deep into flesh. The most famous victim of jousting's hazards was King Henry II of France, who in 1559 took a splinter through the eye during a tournament and died days later, a reminder that even kings were not immune. And then there was the horse. Though rules forbade strikes against the mount, accidents were inevitable. A misaimed lance could cripple or kill a destrier, sending both horse and rider crashing down. Knights who lost their steeds often suffered the worst injuries, as thousands of pounds of armour and animal came down in a tangle. Despite the risks, knights embraced the danger. Injury in the lists was considered a badge of courage, proof of devotion to honour. A scar could be displayed as proudly as a broken lance. Death, though tragic, was sometimes framed as a noble end, preferable to the shame of cowardice. Chroniclers often praised fallen knights as martyrs to chivalry. Still, the risks led to reforms. By the late Middle Ages, helmets were strengthened, lances were hollowed to shatter more easily, and tilts were improved to keep horses apart. Yet no amount of refinement could erase the reality. Jousting remained a violent gamble. Every knight who rode into the lists knew that glory was balanced on the razor's edge of death. Jousting may have begun as a knightly pastime, but by the later Middle Ages it had become a stage for kings and princes to broadcast their power. Hosting a tournament was more than entertainment. It was a political statement. To organise such a lavish event required wealth, manpower, and influence. Every joust held under royal patronage reinforced not only the ideals of chivalry, but also the authority of the crown. Monarchs used tournaments to showcase strength. A king who could field dozens of knights in gleaming armour, draped in heraldic finery, signalled both prosperity and control. Crowds that gathered to watch were reminded quite literally of the grandeur of their ruler. The expenses were enormous. Armour specially crafted for jousts, elaborate banquets, richly decorated lists. But this extravagance was deliberate. To dazzle the nobility and common people alike was to cement loyalty. Royal tournaments also doubled as diplomatic tools. Foreign envoys were often invited, and knights from abroad were welcomed into the lists. In these contests, chivalry became a form of soft power, a chance to impress allies, intimidate rivals, and demonstrate that one's court was the cultural and military heart of Europe. A visiting ambassador might leave not only with admiration, but also with the sense that opposing such a king would be unwise. For ambitious knights, the joust was a pathway to royal favour. A strong performance in front of the king or queen could lead to patronage, titles, or lucrative marriages. Victories in the lists were not just personal triumphs. They could be political stepping stones. Many knights staked their fortunes on the tilt yard, knowing that a single dazzling charge could earn them a place in the monarch's circle. Yet royal patronage also heightened the stakes. To lose before one's sovereign could be humiliating, while to win might arouse envy or suspicion. Kings themselves sometimes entered the lists, both to prove their valour and to embody the knightly ideals they demanded of their subjects. This was risky. Henry VIII of England famously suffered serious injuries during a joust in 1536, but it showed that monarchs were willing to gamble even their own bodies for glory. Thus the joust became a nexus of power, weaving together spectacle, politics, and chivalry. It was never just sport, it was propaganda on horseback, orchestrated beneath the approving gaze of royalty. By the dawn of the Renaissance, jousting had reached its golden age. Courts across Europe celebrated it not merely as a sport, but as a grand ritual that defined knighthood itself. The tilt yard was where legends were made, where honour was won, and where the ideals of chivalry found their most dazzling expression. And yet, as the centuries rolled on, jousting began to fade, its dangers, costs, and changing world slowly chipping away at its once unshakable place in society. The decline was partly practical. Warfare had evolved. Gunpowder, firearms, and disciplined infantry formations began to dominate the battlefield, rendering the knight on horseback less decisive than he once was. The joust, born as a form of training for war, suddenly seemed outdated. Lances and plate armour, once essential, became ceremonial relics rather than useful tools of combat. By the 16th century, jousting was no longer preparation for war. It was theatre, kept alive for tradition and spectacle. Another factor was its danger. Even as equipment improved, jousts remained perilous. The death of King Henry II of France in 1559, killed by a lance splinter through the eye, sent shockwaves across Europe. If even a monarch could die in the lists, many began to question whether the risks outweighed the glory. Gradually, rulers curtailed or banned jousts, preferring safer entertainments that did not risk the lives of their nobles. Yet even in decline, jousting left a powerful legacy. It shaped the very image of knighthood, embedding the idea of the brave warrior who fought not only for victory, but for honour and love. The rituals of heraldry, the ideals of courtly love, the pageantry of tournaments, all of these remained woven into the cultural memory of Europe long after the last lance was broken. Today, jousting lives on in romantic imagination. Festivals, reenactments, and literature keep the image alive. Two knights thundering toward one another, banners snapping, the crowd holding its breath for the clash. It is less a sport now than a symbol, a reminder of an age where honour was fought for on horseback, beneath the eyes of lords and ladies, with splintering wood and steel ringing in the air. Thus, the joust ended not in a single blow, but in transformation. From training ground to spectacle, from deadly combat to legend, jousting's story mirrors the rise and fall of knighthood itself. For the Pythia, the famed oracle of Delphi, was not born into her role, she was chosen. In the earliest centuries, the position was reserved for a young virgin, symbolizing purity and closeness to Apollo. But after one priestess was abducted for her beauty, the Delphians changed the rule. From then on, the Pythia was selected from older women, beyond the reach of such dangers, yet still dressed in maiden's clothing to honour tradition. This choice reflected a paradox at the heart of her role. Though human, she stood as a vessel of the god, both ordinary and extraordinary at once. The process of becoming the Pythia was as sacred as it was transformative. She was drawn from the local women of Delphi, not from distant lands or noble families. Her authority came not from bloodline or wealth, but from her willingness to surrender her life to Apollo. Once chosen, she underwent rituals of purification. She bathed in the cold waters of the Castalian spring, believed to cleanse both body and spirit. She fasted, abstained from worldly pleasures, and performed sacrifices to ensure she was worthy of the god's voice. From this moment forward, her existence was no longer her own. She belonged to Apollo. The transformation was both spiritual and social. The woman who once lived among her neighbours became something apart from them, set on a higher plane. She would live near the sanctuary, bound to the rhythms of ritual, her identity absorbed into the role. To the Greeks, she ceased to be an individual, and instead became the mouthpiece of Apollo, her human name fading, replaced by the eternal title, Pythia. This elevation brought both reverence and burden. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world, kings, generals, colonists, and merchants, all seeking her counsel. The responsibility was immense. Her words could determine wars, alliances, and the fates of cities. Yet she was still human, a woman chosen from the people of Delphi, now tasked with embodying the divine. In her selection, one sees the essence of the oracle itself, the fusion of mortal fragility with divine authority. To be chosen as Pythia was to surrender the ordinary life of a woman in exchange for the extraordinary role of Apollo's living voice, a role that would shape the destiny of nations. The voice of the Pythia could not exist without Delphi itself. The place was as much a part of the prophecy as the woman who spoke it. High on the southern slopes of Mount Parnassus, the sanctuary of Apollo overlooked the valley of the river Pleistos, a landscape of silver-green olive groves shimmering in the sunlight. Travellers arriving from distant corners of the Greek world felt the awe immediately. They were stepping into a place that claimed to be the very centre of the earth. According to legend, Zeus released two eagles from opposite ends of the world, and they met here, at Delphi. The omphalos, the navel stone, stood in the temple to mark this spot. To consult the Pythia was not only to seek Apollo's wisdom, but also to place oneself at the cosmic axis, where heaven, earth, and the underworld were believed to converge. The sanctuary was built to inspire reverence. Pilgrims approached by the sacred way, a winding path lined with treasuries built by powerful city-states. Each treasury was a glittering showcase of offerings, golden statues, tripods, and precious votives, gifts left to honour Apollo and secure his favour. For rival cities, these treasuries were also propaganda, a reminder to all who visited of their wealth, victories, and piety. Walking this road, a pilgrim was surrounded not only by divine presence, but by the weight of Greek politics. At the heart of the sanctuary rose the great temple of Apollo. Its columns gleamed in the sun, its interior heavy with the smell of burning incense and animal sacrifice. Inside was the Adyton, the innermost chamber where the Pythia sat upon a tripod over a chasm in the earth. Here, myth claimed, vapours rose from the underworld, carrying Apollo's voice upward to mingle with the breath of the priestess. Whether or not the fumes truly existed, The setting gave the impression of mystery, otherworldliness, and danger. Every element of Delphi was designed to heighten the sense that this was no ordinary place. The mountains above, the theatre carved into the hillside, the stadium for games, all added layers of sacredness. To stand here was to feel small, yet connected to something vast. The Pythia's words carried weight precisely because they were spoken in a place where mortals believed the gods walked among them. On the appointed days, when Apollo's power was thought to be strongest, the Pythia would prepare to enter the Adyton, the innermost chamber of his temple. This was no casual act. It was a carefully orchestrated ritual meant to transform an ordinary woman into a mouthpiece of the divine. Every step mattered, and every gesture carried meaning. The day began with purification. The Pythia bathed in the Castalian spring, whose icy waters were said to cleanse not only the body, but the soul. From there she drank from the sacred Cassotis spring near the temple, believed to carry the power of prophecy itself. A priest would sacrifice a goat on Apollo's altar, pouring cold water over it to ensure it trembled, a sign that the god accepted the ritual. Only then could the oracle begin. Dressed in simple robes, often white, the Pythia entered the dim chamber of the Adyton. At its centre stood the sacred tripod, a bronze seat supported by 3 legs shaped like coiled serpents, echoing Apollo's victory over the Python. The dragon said to have once guarded this place. She seated herself above a fissure in the earth, where myth claimed vapours rose. The air would be heavy with incense, the flicker of torches casting shadows across the stone walls, as priests and petitioners waited in reverent silence. Then came the transformation. The Pythia would inhale, chant, and rock rhythmically, entering a trance-like state. Ancient sources describe her speaking in a voice not quite her own, words spilling out rapidly, sometimes incoherent, sometimes wild, as if Apollo himself had seized her tongue. Attendants, known as prophets, stood nearby to catch her words, shaping them into responses for those who had come seeking guidance. What the pilgrims received was rarely straightforward. Apollo spoke in riddles, double meanings, and ambiguities. The Pythia might declare victory, but leave unsaid whose victory it would be. She might urge a colony to be founded where the oracle points, leaving leaders to interpret which patch of land fit the cryptic phrase. The mystery was intentional. To speak plainly would limit divine wisdom. To speak in riddles made the words timeless, adaptable, and haunting. Thus, prophecy was not simply given, it was performed. The Pythia's ritual transformed the temple into a theatre of the sacred, where mortals brushed against the divine in words half mortal, half god. The Pythia did not speak her riddles into the void. She answered questions brought to her from across the Greek world. To Delphi came an astonishing range of petitioners, kings weighing war, generals plotting campaigns, merchants hoping to secure fortune, and ordinary citizens seeking guidance for family matters. No matter one's rank, the process was the same. Each pilgrim first paid tribute, for Apollo's wisdom was not given freely. Richer visitors might dedicate golden statues, tripods, or entire treasuries, while poorer pilgrims brought animals for sacrifice or smaller tokens of devotion. Consultation followed a strict hierarchy. Not everyone could ask the oracle at will. Priority was given to certain city-states and their envoys, who had earned promontia, the right to consult first, often as a reward for their devotion or offerings. This meant that in times of crisis, powerful leaders could secure the Pythia's words before their rivals, turning prophecy into a political advantage. When their turn came, petitioners presented their question in as clear a form as possible. Yet here lay the irony. While they sought clarity, they received ambiguity. A king might ask, "Should I go to war?" And the Pythia's answer, chanted in her trance, could be something like, "A great empire will fall." Which empire exactly was left for the king to decide. The responsibility shifted back to the petitioner, whose interpretation often shaped destiny as much as the prophecy itself. Some came with deeply personal concerns. Would a family line continue? Was a marriage blessed by the gods? Could a voyage across the sea be successful? The Pythia's responses, however cryptic, carried immense authority. Few dared to ignore her words, lest they risk offending Apollo himself. The power of the oracle lay not only in what she said, but in the reverence people gave her utterances. And so, the sacred way was always busy. Delegations in splendid dress rubbed shoulders with weary travellers, each carrying hopes, fears, and questions. For some, the oracle confirmed their plans, bolstering their courage. For others, her words sowed doubt or hesitation. Either way, no one left unchanged. To have spoken with the Pythia was to touch the divine, even if the meaning of that touch remained elusive. The power of the Pythia is best understood not in ritual, but in results. Her words shaped some of the most pivotal decisions of the ancient world, guiding kings, generals, and statesmen at moments when hesitation could mean ruin. The Pythia's prophecies, often wrapped in ambiguity, became legendary, not only for their influence, but also for the clever ways they could be interpreted, or misinterpreted. One of the most famous examples is Croesus, king of Lydia. In the 6th century BCE, he asked whether he should wage war against the rising power of Persia. The Pythia replied that if he crossed the river Halys, a great empire will fall. Croesus took this as a promise of Persian defeat. He marched, fought, and was crushed, only to realize too late that the empire doomed by Apollo's words was his own. The lesson echoed for centuries. The oracle was never wrong, only misunderstood. Another renowned prophecy came during the Persian Wars. When the Greeks faced invasion by Xerxes, they consulted Delphi in desperation. The Pythia's first words were grim, warning that no defence could hold. But pressed again, she delivered the cryptic assurance that a wooden wall shall not fail. Athenians debated the meaning. Was it their city's palisades, or something else? Themistocles argued it meant their navy. Trusting this interpretation, Athens evacuated and fought at sea, winning the decisive Battle of Salamis. Here, the riddle saved Greece. Colonization, too, often began with the oracle. Greek settlers embarking on voyages to unknown lands sought the Pythia's blessing. She told them where to build, what gods to honour, and what dangers to avoid. The founding of Cyrene in North Africa, Syracuse in Sicily, and countless other cities carried her signature. To claim Apollo's sanction was to anchor a new community in divine legitimacy. Even individuals found their fates sealed by her voice. Oedipus, in myth, heard from Delphi that he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. His desperate attempts to avoid that destiny only ensured its fulfillment. The story became the archetype of prophecy's power, a truth so inescapable that human action only tightens the snare. These examples reveal why rulers risked fortunes to consult her. The Pythia's words could doom empires, inspire salvation, or become eternal warnings. Whether through victory or tragedy, her prophecies never failed to prove unforgettable. What truly happened when the Pythia entered her trance? To the ancient Greeks, there was no doubt. Apollo himself descended into her body, seizing her tongue, filling her lungs, and pouring out his will in riddling words. To modern minds, the question is more complicated, tangled in myth, ritual, and fragments of ancient testimony. Some ancient writers described the Pythia as trembling, foaming at the mouth, or speaking in strange, disjointed phrases. Others painted a calmer picture, in which she chanted or muttered steadily while attendants listened carefully, recording every syllable. What all accounts agree on is that her voice was not her own. Petitioners believed they were hearing the god, not the woman. That belief gave her words their unshakable weight. The setting itself added to the aura of divine possession. The tripod seat, placed above a fissure in the earth, was said to emit vapours that induced her trance. Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi, insisted that a sweet-smelling pneuma rose from the ground, carrying Apollo's essence. Modern archaeologists have debated this claim. For centuries, skeptics dismissed the vapours as legend. Yet in recent years, studies have found that the temple sits above intersecting geological faults. These faults may have released gases such as ethylene, which in concentrated doses can cause disorientation, euphoria, and trance-like states. The ancient myth of the Earth's breath may, in fact, have had a geological root. Still, science alone cannot explain the cultural phenomenon. Even without fumes, the ritual itself was overwhelming. Imagine the dim chamber, lit by torches, filled with incense and chanting. The weight of expectation, the presence of priests, the long line of petitioners waiting outside. It was a theatre of the sacred. The Pythia, fasting, purified, and psychologically primed, may have needed no chemical aid to enter a heightened state of consciousness. Her body, her breath, and her voice became the focus of an entire world's attention, magnifying the power of suggestion. For the Greeks, though, explanation was irrelevant. What mattered was the message, not the mechanism. Whether through God, gas, or ritual ecstasy, the Pythia's words carried the authority of Apollo. Mystery was part of the oracle's strength. Her voice had to feel otherworldly to command the destiny of nations. The Pythia was not simply a religious figure, she was a force in Greek politics. Her words, delivered in the dim chamber of Apollo's temple, could ripple outward to shape alliances, justify wars, or topple ambitions. For leaders across the Greek world, to have Apollo's voice on one side was to claim divine sanction. No decree, no campaign, no treaty carried more weight than one backed by Delphi. City-states competed fiercely for the oracle's favour. Athens, Sparta, Corinth and Thebes all sent rich gifts to Delphi, each building treasuries along the sacred way as dazzling advertisements of piety. These offerings weren't only devotional, they were political investments. The more a city lavished upon Apollo's sanctuary, the more likely it was to secure favourable oracles, or at least priority in consultation. In a world where prophecy could decide the timing of a war or the founding of a colony, influence at Delphi was a prize worth fortunes. The Pythia's words often echoed the shifting balance of power. When Sparta sought legitimacy for its conquests, the oracle frequently endorsed them. When Athens rose to dominance, it, too, found Delphi a willing ally at times. Some historians suspect the priests who assisted the Pythia may have steered her words subtly, aligning prophecy with the political winds. Yet to the Greeks, this was not manipulation. It was Apollo's will, expressed in terms mortals could understand. The oracle also influenced diplomacy. Before embarking on risky ventures, Greek states sought her blessing. Colonists setting out across the seas carried Apollo's sanction with them, which lent authority to new settlements and discouraged rivals. Even foreign rulers recognized Delphi's clout. Croesus of Lydia and later Roman emperors sent lavish gifts, acknowledging the oracle's symbolic power over the Greek world. But the Pythia's authority was not absolute. Leaders sometimes ignored her, and when disaster followed, the blame was laid on human arrogance rather than the oracle's fallibility. This dynamic only strengthened her prestige. Prophecy could not be wrong, only misapplied. In this way, the oracle became both shield and sword, an untouchable source of legitimacy that rulers wielded carefully. Thus, the Pythia was more than a prophetess. She was a political institution, her voice woven into the machinery of power. Through her, Apollo's temple at Delphi became the beating heart of Greek decision-making, a place where destiny and politics met beneath the shadow of Mount Parnassus. For nearly 1,000 years, the Pythia's voice carried across Greece and beyond. But no institution lasts forever. By the late classical and Hellenistic periods, the oracle at Delphi began to lose the unshakable authority it once held. Wars, shifting empires, and changing faiths all chipped away at Apollo's sanctuary until the Pythia's voice was reduced to little more than an echo of its former power. The decline began with politics. As Greece fractured into rival leagues and later fell under Macedonian and Roman influence, the independence of Delphi eroded. Kings and emperors still consulted the oracle, but they no longer depended on it as Greek city-states once had. When Alexander the Great came to Delphi in the 4th century BCE, legend tells us he physically dragged the reluctant Pythia into the Adyton until she proclaimed him invincible. The scene symbolized a shift. No longer was the oracle unquestioned. Powerful men could bend it to their will. Wars also scarred the sanctuary. Delphi was plundered more than once, and though its treasuries remained impressive, the aura of untouchable sanctity began to fade. Rome's expansion further diminished its role. Roman emperors respected Delphi, but they had their own centres of prophecy and power. By the time of Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, the oracle was more a cultural relic than a decisive voice of empire. Religion, too, played its part. As Christianity spread through the Roman world, pagan oracles were increasingly condemned as false or demonic. By the 4th century CE, Christian emperors actively suppressed such practices. The temple of Apollo at Delphi fell silent, its rituals abandoned, its sacred fires extinguished. The once revered fissure, where Apollo's breath was believed to rise, was left to crumble in darkness. Yet decline did not erase memory. Even as the oracle's voice faded, its legend grew. Writers, historians, and poets preserved the tales of cryptic prophecies that swayed the course of history. The image of the Pythia, seated upon her tripod, became part of the cultural fabric of the ancient world. By the end, the oracle was no longer a living voice but a myth, remembered more for what it had once been than for what it still was. Delphi's silence marked the end of an age when gods spoke directly to mortals, leaving behind riddles that still haunt us today. Though the temple of Apollo at Delphi eventually fell silent, the Pythia's legacy refused to fade. For centuries, her image lingered in the imagination of poets, historians, and philosophers, who treated her as a symbol of humanity's enduring hunger for divine guidance. To the ancient Greeks, she had been more than a woman. She was the embodiment of Apollo's wisdom, the hinge on which the fate of nations could turn. That sense of awe never truly disappeared. Her influence on culture is profound. The very idea of prophecy as mysterious, ambiguous, and double-edged is rooted in the Delphic model. Modern expressions like "know thyself" and "nothing in excess," maxims carved at the entrance of Apollo's temple, still echo as philosophical truths. Her riddling responses shaped not only the course of wars and colonization, but also the way later generations thought about fate, as something at once knowable and yet impossible to fully escape. Philosophers often grappled with her meaning. Socrates famously claimed that the oracle declared him the wisest man alive, not because he knew everything, but because he knew how little he truly understood. From this story grew entire schools of thought on humility, wisdom, and the pursuit of truth. In this way, the Pythia's influence extended beyond politics into the very heart of philosophy. Even as Christianity eclipsed the old gods, the memory of Delphi persisted. Medieval scholars cited her prophecies, Renaissance artists painted her likeness, and Enlightenment thinkers dissected her words. In each retelling, she was recast, sometimes as a pagan sorceress, sometimes as a vessel of timeless wisdom. Always, she represented the mystery of knowledge itself, partial, veiled, and powerful. Today, the ruins of Delphi still draw travellers who walk the sacred way, past broken treasuries and worn steps, to the remains of Apollo's temple. The valley below spreads wide and silent, but visitors speak of feeling the same atmosphere of reverence the ancients described. The stones themselves seem to whisper of the days when a woman seated on a tripod could make kings tremble with a single phrase. The Pythia's true power lies not in whether her prophecies were literal or mystical, but in the human need they revealed, the desire to hear the voice of the divine guiding mortal choices. In her, history meets myth, and myth continues to shape how we think about fate, wisdom, and the unknown. To be a mother in the Middle Ages was both a blessing and a burden, a role steeped in duty, faith, and constant danger. Unlike today, where motherhood is often viewed through personal choice and emotion, in medieval Europe, it was framed as a woman's central responsibility. From peasant cottages to royal courts, society expected women to bring forth children, secure the family's future, and in doing so, serve both God and community. Marriage was almost always followed by the expectation of pregnancy. A woman's body was seen primarily as a vessel for lineage, and her worth was often measured by her fertility. For noble women, this meant producing heirs to secure dynasties and political alliances. For peasants, it meant raising enough children to help in the fields, tend livestock, and ensure survival in a harsh economy. But regardless of class, the pressure to conceive was immense, and childlessness carried stigma. The risks, however, were staggering. Medieval medicine was poorly equipped to handle complications of pregnancy and childbirth. Women faced infections, hemorrhage, and obstructed labour with little more than prayers, charms, and the aid of midwives who relied on herbal remedies and experience passed down through generations. Childbirth was so perilous that it was sometimes referred to as a woman's battlefield. A mother could go into labour knowing it might be the last act of her life. Infant mortality was equally grim. Diseases, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and accidents claimed countless young lives. Some estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 3 children never reached adulthood. For mothers, this meant navigating the constant cycle of birth, loss, and grief. Yet life went on. Women were expected to endure and to conceive again, often within months of a loss. Religion offered both comfort and pressure. The Virgin Mary was upheld as the ideal mother, pure, selfless, and endlessly nurturing. Sermons and devotional texts reminded women that motherhood was their holy duty, and surviving childbirth was sometimes interpreted as divine mercy. At the same time, baptism rituals and prayers gave families a sense of protection, however fragile, over their newborns. Motherhood in the Middle Ages was thus a complex tapestry of joy and sorrow, duty and danger. It was at once a sacred calling and a lifelong trial, where love for one's children was shadowed by the ever-present fear of loss. For medieval noblewomen, motherhood was not simply a personal matter, it was a political act. Their primary duty was to produce heirs, and in doing so, secure dynasties, strengthen alliances, and preserve the fortunes of their families. A noblewoman's body was, in many ways, the battlefield on which the future of kingdoms and estates was fought. Her ability, or failure, to bear children could shift the balance of power across Europe. Marriage itself was rarely about romance. Most unions were arranged with politics and property in mind, and the success of that arrangement was judged in the nursery. A queen who produced sons was celebrated as a stabilizer of the realm. A barren queen, or one who bore only daughters, risked humiliation, annulment, or being pushed aside for another. In this way, noble women lived under relentless pressure, their private lives scrutinized by courtiers, chroniclers, and clergy alike. Pregnancy among the nobility was both ritualized and closely guarded. Noble women often withdrew into confinement during the later stages of pregnancy, attended by midwives, ladies-in-waiting, and sometimes physicians if the family could afford them. Birth was accompanied by prayers and offerings to saints, particularly Saint Margaret, the patron of childbirth. Yet even with wealth and attendants, noble women faced the same mortal dangers as their peasant counterparts. No amount of luxury could protect them from infection or hemorrhage. Queens died in childbirth as frequently as villagers did, leaving kingdoms shaken by sudden succession crises. The children of noblewomen, especially sons, were not theirs to raise freely. Heirs were often taken into the care of tutors, nurses, and guardians who shaped their education and political training. Daughters were groomed for marriage alliances, sometimes betrothed before they were even old enough to walk. Still, mothers played an important role in instilling values of loyalty, piety, and honour, and some wielded considerable influence over their children long into adulthood. The maternal bond, though mediated by politics, was still powerful. For noble women, the stakes of motherhood extended far beyond the home. Their wombs carried the weight of dynasties, and their success or failure in producing heirs shaped the destinies of nations. Behind the glittering halls of castles and courts, motherhood was both the most celebrated and most dangerous role a noblewoman could play. For peasant women, motherhood was less about dynasties and politics, and more about sheer survival. Life in the countryside was grueling, and children were both a blessing and a necessity. They provided the labour that kept households afloat, tending animals, working fields, hauling water, and spinning wool. Yet to reach that point, both mother and child first had to survive the brutal realities of childbirth and infancy. Peasant mothers rarely had the luxury of retreating into confinement during pregnancy. Work did not pause simply because a woman was expecting. Fields still needed to be ploughed, animals milked, bread baked, and water fetched. Many women laboured in the fields until the final days of pregnancy, and some even gave birth in barns or cottages with little more than a midwife, or sometimes just female neighbours by their side. The process was risky, and complications often meant death in a world without reliable medicine. Infant mortality cast a long shadow over motherhood. Illnesses like dysentery, fevers, and respiratory infections claimed countless young lives, and nutrition was always precarious. Breastfeeding was the norm, but if a mother died in childbirth, her baby's survival was immediately in doubt. In such cases, families might turn to a wet nurse or rely on animal milk, both risky alternatives. Mothers knew from experience that not every child would live, yet the grief of loss did not grow easier with repetition. Many families buried infants in unmarked graves near the home, their memory preserved only within the family's sorrow. Despite hardship, peasant motherhood was not without joy and resilience. Children who survived became a mother's greatest allies in the daily fight to endure poverty and hunger. Young sons joined their fathers in the fields, while daughters helped with cooking, spinning, and caring for younger siblings. Every child who reached adulthood strengthened the household's future. In this way, motherhood was both an emotional journey and an economic strategy. Faith offered peasant mothers comfort. Prayers to saints, charms hung in cottages, and the protective waters of baptism all gave a sense of hope. The Virgin Mary, depicted cradling the Christ child, served as an idealized reflection of their own struggles. Though unlike Mary, most mothers bore not one child but many, often at the cost of their own health. For peasant mothers, survival and sacrifice defined motherhood. Their children were their labour force, their legacy, and their only hope in a world that was constantly pressing them to the edge of endurance. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a moment of both anticipation and dread. Without the benefits of modern medicine, every pregnancy was fraught with uncertainty, and every labour carried the risk of death. For medieval women, this reality was so well known that it shaped not only how childbirth was approached, but also how it was ritualised. The central figures in this drama were midwives. These women, often older and experienced in attending births, were the primary guardians of mothers and infants. They had no formal training, but relied on knowledge passed down through practice, herbs, and tradition. Midwives knew which plants might ease pain, such as rue or sage, and which prayers or charms could offer comfort when medicine fell short. Their authority in the birthing chamber was respected, even if men, physicians, priests, or husbands, hovered outside, eager to assert control over outcomes they rarely witnessed. The birth itself usually took place in the home. Women in labour were surrounded by female relatives, friends, and neighbours, forming a circle of support that reflected the communal nature of medieval life. The room was often darkened and warmed, with candles lit to invoke divine protection. Religious symbols, crosses, relics, or images of the Virgin Mary were placed nearby. Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, was especially invoked, and prayers or charms bearing her name were recited to safeguard both mother and child. Yet for all the ritual, the dangers were real. Prolonged or obstructed labour could lead to death, and in cases where the mother was unlikely to survive, the Church insisted that the child be baptised immediately, sometimes even while still in the womb, if possible. This emphasis on baptism reveals the deep intertwining of faith and fear, as families hoped to secure the infant's soul, even if its body could not be saved. When a birth was successful, it was a moment of profound relief. The child was swaddled tightly, believed to ensure proper growth, and shown to the father and community. For the mother, however, the ordeal was not over. Many suffered infections, hemorrhage, or lasting injury. Surviving childbirth was itself considered a blessing, a narrow victory won on what many called a woman's battlefield. Through midwives, rituals, and faith, medieval women faced one of life's most dangerous moments with courage. Every safe delivery was a triumph over odds that were stacked against them, and every child born was proof of resilience in a world shadowed by mortality. The arrival of a child was only the beginning of a mother's burden. In the Middle Ages, infancy was the most fragile stage of life, and caring for a newborn required constant vigilance in a world where survival was far from guaranteed. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents claimed countless young lives, making every mother's role a mixture of love, labour, and fear. Breastfeeding was the most common form of nourishment. For peasant women, it was both natural and necessary, ensuring that their infants received sustenance even when food was scarce. Noble women, however, often delegated this task to wet nurses, believing that their own health, appearances, or obligations demanded it. This choice reflected class divides. Where a peasant mother's bond with her child was forged at the breast, aristocratic infants sometimes grew up closer to their nurses than to their biological mothers. Still, noble women were expected to oversee the care of their children, ensuring proper feeding, swaddling, and protection. Swaddling itself was a universal practice. Infants were wrapped tightly in cloth strips, restricting their movement in the belief that it promoted proper growth and kept them safe. A swaddled child was easier to carry, lay down, or keep warm in drafty homes, though to modern eyes it may appear harsh. Mothers also used charms and amulets to protect their babies from evil spirits, or the evil eye, a reflection of how vulnerable newborns were perceived to be. Daily care went hand in hand with religious duty. Baptism usually took place within days of birth, a practice driven by high infant mortality. Parents feared that an unbaptized child who died would be denied entry into heaven, so priests were summoned quickly. The ritual was a community event as well, formally welcoming the child into both the faith and society. Mothers also had to protect their infants against the harsher realities of medieval life. Smoke-filled cottages, cold winters, and unsanitary conditions left babies prone to respiratory illness and infection. Accidents were common. Infants rolling into fires, drowning in basins, or being crushed in bed were real dangers. Such tragedies were so frequent that many families came to accept them as part of life's cruel rhythm. And yet, amidst the risks, there was joy. Mothers sang lullabies, whispered prayers, and delighted in the milestones of growth. To raise a child past infancy was a triumph worth celebrating, a fragile victory against a world that often seemed determined to snatch it away. If an infant survived its perilous first years, a new phase of motherhood began, one shaped less by swaddling and survival, and more by guidance, discipline, and preparation for adult life. In the Middle Ages, childhood was fleeting. By the age of 7, many children were already expected to take on meaningful tasks, and mothers were at the heart of this transition. For peasant families, childhood was woven into the rhythms of labour. Young boys were sent into the fields with their fathers, while girls remained close to their mothers, learning the domestic skills that would define their adult lives: spinning, weaving, cooking, and tending younger siblings. Mothers became their daughters' first teachers, passing down not only practical skills, but also the values of thrift, obedience, and endurance. Sons, too, were shaped by maternal influence, at least until they were old enough to apprentice, herd animals, or learn trades. Noble children experienced a different kind of training. Sons destined for knighthood were often sent away from home at a young age to serve as pages in another noble household, while daughters were groomed for future marriages that would secure alliances. Mothers of noble rank had less direct involvement in their sons' education, but they played a crucial role in instilling piety, manners, and the social graces necessary for court life. A noblewoman's guidance could influence the reputation of her entire family through the conduct of her children. Religion permeated childhood, and mothers ensured that their children learned prayers, attended Mass, and absorbed the moral lessons preached by the Church. Stories of saints and biblical figures were passed along at the hearth, shaping children's understanding of right and wrong. Mothers were often responsible for moral correction as well. Discipline ranged from stern words to physical punishment, accepted in medieval society as necessary for moulding character. Yet, even with heavy burdens, moments of affection shone through. Archaeological finds and manuscripts reveal toys, wooden horses, dolls, and carved figurines that suggest children did play, and mothers likely encouraged such joys where they could. Songs, rhymes, and games created brief escapes from the hardships of medieval life, and mothers were often the ones to nurture these small pockets of happiness. Ultimately, medieval motherhood during childhood was about preparing sons and daughters for lives that would arrive quickly and demand much. A mother's role was equal parts caretaker, teacher, and moral guide, ensuring that her children could survive not only infancy, but the demands of a world that seldom spared the unprepared. To be a mother in the Middle Ages was to live with constant awareness of death. High child mortality rates meant that almost every woman endured the loss of at least one child, and for many, the grief was repeated again and again. Disease, famine, war, and accident conspired against survival, and even the wealthiest families were not immune. For mothers, each loss left wounds that faith and duty could soothe but never erase. The Church taught that mothers should find solace in God's will, framing death as part of divine providence. Baptism offered comfort, ensuring that infants who died early would be carried to heaven rather than left in limbo. Yet the theology of consolation did not dull the personal pain of burying a child. Medieval sources, from laments in literature to accounts in chronicles, show mothers openly mourning, proof that grief was not hidden, but woven into the reality of life. For noblewomen, the stakes of loss were not only emotional, but political. The death of a son could mean dynastic crisis, while the death of a daughter could unravel years of alliance building. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Blanche of Castile endured the deaths of multiple children, each loss reshaping the fragile webs of medieval power. Their grief was personal, but it also carried political consequences, felt far beyond the nursery. Peasant mothers faced grief on a more intimate scale, often without chroniclers to record it. Their children might die quietly of fevers, malnutrition, or accidents, leaving families to mourn in silence. Burial grounds near village churches filled with tiny graves, testaments to lives cut short. Mothers sometimes named multiple children with the same name, a sign of both remembrance and hope that at least one might live on. Despite the frequency of loss, grief was no less profound. A mother might quickly conceive again, pressed by necessity, but that did not mean she forgot. Poems, prayers, and even protective charms reveal an enduring love and a desperate desire to shield children from dangers beyond her control. Maternal grief in the Middle Ages was thus both universal and deeply personal. It reminded mothers daily of the fragility of life, Yet it also underscored the extraordinary resilience required to continue raising children in a world where survival was never guaranteed. In the Middle Ages, motherhood was not seen merely as a biological role, but as a spiritual vocation. The Church framed a woman's ability to bear and raise children as part of God's divine plan. Every stage of motherhood, from conception to childbirth to raising children, was bound up with rituals, prayers, and the ever-present influence of faith. The Virgin Mary stood at the heart of this religious ideal. Depicted endlessly in art as the serene Mother of Christ, she became the model for all women. Mothers were urged to emulate her humility, patience, and devotion, even though their lives were filled with hardship and danger far beyond the polished images painted in manuscripts. Mary's role as intercessor also offered comfort. Women prayed to her for safe childbirth, for protection over infants, and for strength in raising children. In her, they saw both divine perfection and a reflection of their own struggles. Beyond Mary, other saints became central to motherhood. Saint Margaret of Antioch was the patron saint of childbirth, and mothers often kept charms, relics, or texts bearing her name close during labour. Her protection was invoked against the dangers of delivery, which many viewed as spiritual as well as physical battles. Baptism, too, carried immense weight. It was not simply a ritual, but a safeguard for the child's soul. Parents rushed to baptize newborns within days, fearing that an unbaptized child who died would be denied entry into heaven. Religion also shaped how mothers viewed discipline and care. Raising children was seen as not only a duty to family, but a duty to God. Teaching prayers, ensuring regular attendance at Mass, and guiding children to live morally upright lives were as important as feeding or clothing them. To fail as a mother was, in the eyes of the Church, to risk failing one's soul. At the same time, faith provided a framework for coping with loss. When children died, as so many did, priests reminded grieving mothers that their child was now with God, safe from worldly suffering. While grief never vanished, religion gave meaning to tragedy, helping mothers endure repeated cycles of loss and renewal. Thus, medieval motherhood was sanctified, elevated beyond mere survival into a calling defined by divine purpose. It was a daily negotiation between earthly hardship and heavenly hope, a constant reminder that in raising children, mothers were believed to be serving God himself. Though centuries have passed, the echoes of medieval motherhood still linger in how we understand family, faith, and the female role in society. To be a mother in the Middle Ages was to live at the crossroads of love and loss, duty and danger. It was not a private experience, but one shaped by religion, politics, and community expectations, an experience that left a lasting cultural imprint. The most striking legacy is the idealization of motherhood itself. The Virgin Mary, elevated in medieval devotion as the perfect mother, created a model that shaped Western ideas for generations. Even long after the Middle Ages, women were measured against this standard of purity, sacrifice, and maternal care. Art and literature carried forward the medieval association of motherhood with sanctity, casting the figure of the mother as both nurturer and moral guide. Practices from medieval motherhood also endured. The role of midwives, the tradition of baptism within days of birth, and the belief in maternal responsibility for children's moral and religious education continued well into the early modern era. The structure of family life, with mothers at its core, set patterns that influenced European households for centuries. Yet the hardships of medieval mothers also form part of their legacy. Their resilience in the face of staggering infant and maternal mortality left behind stories of survival that remind us how fragile life once was. Chronicles of noble women who died in childbirth, or folk traditions recording the struggles of peasant women, highlight the enormous risks they bore. These stories resonate today, offering perspective on the progress of medicine and the deep human costs that shaped medieval society. Emotional legacies remain too. While records from peasants are scarce, evidence from letters, poems, and religious texts reveals that maternal love, grief, and pride were just as profound then as they are now. Behind every dynastic calculation or peasant labourer's struggle stood mothers who hoped, prayed, and sacrificed for their children. Ultimately, the legacy of medieval motherhood is a testament to endurance. It was a role at once glorified and burdened, revered in religious ideals yet scarred by constant risk. In remembering it, we see not only the constraints placed upon women, but also their strength in carrying families and entire societies through an age of hardship.